Our first speaker today is Dr. Hugh Ross. He's an astrophysicist. He's the president and founder of Reasons to Believe. And he got his degree in physics, undergraduate degree, from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto, which will give you a hint that he is Canadian. He continued his research on quasars and galaxies as a postdoctoral fellow at Caltech. And in 1986, he launched Reasons to Believe to research, develop, and communicate the compatibility between science and Christianity. Hugh has authored or co-authored numerous books, which include Weathering Climate Change, The Creator and the Cosmos, and Improbable Planet. Hugh, if you'd like to come up, we would like you to start us off.
Well, it's good to be back with you again for Skeptics Forum, and we will take questions on any subject, but we've been asked to introduce the theme of UFOs. And I became an expert in UFOs not on purpose. It's completely by accident. And unlike most astronomers, I was an amateur before I became a professional. I began my amateur astronomy when I was 15, and when I was 16, I was actually Canada's leading variable star observer. And they made me the director of observations for the Vancouver chapter of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And in that role, I said, we need to have an exhibit at the Pacific National Exhibition. Moreover, we can get people coming by our exhibit to help us grind our mirrors. I mean, this is a win-win. So we had an exhibit there, but they put us right next to the Flying Saucer Club. And so people would walk by the Flying Saucer Club booth, and then they would come to our booth and say, what do you think? And because of all the hours I had outside at night, I wound up having to address the questions. And then when I went on to the University of British Columbia, they found out that I was an amateur astronomer, and they said, great, we're going to have you deal with all the UFO reports we get sent to us. And that continued on at the University of Toronto and Caltech, and the different observatories are operated. So I wound up over the decades literally handling thousands of UFO reports. And I quickly learned that I always had to ask the question, how long were you outside before you saw this UFO? And it was less than 20 minutes. I said, well, you know, it takes time for your eyes to adapt from being outside to inside to being outside. And what happens in the first 20 minutes is that your eyes will often see bright glows of light in the horizon. And that's just your eyes. It's got nothing to do with what's on the horizon. And that would happen to me frequently when I would set up my telescope. I would see these lights. And so I just realized, okay, for the first 20 minutes, that's going to happen. The other thing I also recognize is I always had to ask people, well, were you inside when you saw this cluster of UFOs in the horizon? They said, well, why did you ask? And it says, well, if there's a pane of glass between you and what you saw on the horizon, maybe you were seeing the reflection of the chandelier behind you. The chandelier effect accounts for quite a significant percentage of UFO reports. And also I noticed that when people see a fireball for the first time, they're convinced it's a UFO. Say, what's a fireball? It's a meteor coming through the sky where the meteor will engage you at such close range, it'll be the size of the moon or larger in the sky. I've personally seen fireballs that were 4 times the diameter of the moon. Now, I will caution you, if you see a fireball that doesn't move in the sky and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, move and move quickly. So it's heading right at you. So in my experience, about 99% of what people report to me as UFOs, I could explain either as natural phenomena, and being at the university, there were different groups of undergraduate students who loved to pull off UFO hoaxes. So they would actually set up these balloons and let them explode in the atmosphere and have a whole cluster and get a real good laugh when this was reported the next day in the newspaper as a UFO encounter. So a lot of them are hoaxes, and some of them are secret military activity. I had that happen to me when I was at the Algonquin Radio Observatory. There was this aircraft that flew rapidly over towards our telescope, stopped, and hovered. But we could detect radio observations coming from this, so we called NORAD headquarters, which was about 100 miles from our telescope in northern Ontario, and said, could you please tell your pilots to not hover over our telescope? I know they're curious, seeing this massive dish in the wilderness, and they said, we have no such instrument. They insisted that they did not have the technology that could do that. And they said, well, if you don't stop it, we'll call the Ottawa newspapers. And they said, don't do that, don't do that. And suddenly we had no more incidents of these aircraft. But it was another decade before it was announced that the US military had aircraft at that kind of capability. So that accounts for a number. But there is a residual. And so we have a DVD that we've produced at Reasons to Believe, and it's called the RUFO Hypothesis. And it's referring to the 1% residual. And the 1% residual are phenomena that can't be explained as natural phenomena, as hoaxes or secret military activity. And moreover, they reveal themselves as being real phenomena, but not physical phenomena. Now, when I was at the University of Toronto, I briefly had Carl Sagan as a professor. And in one of those lectures, he spoke on UFOs and completely dismissed the phenomena as having any bearing on reality. But as an atheist, his worldview did not tolerate the possible existence of non-physical reality. As a Christian, my worldview does. And so the phenomena I'm referring to, and by the way, this residual UFO database is not small. It's millions. And so when you say 1%, that means hundreds of millions of UFOs are being reported. And that's true. It's like 500 million have been reported. But there's several million that fall into this 1% category. So it's not a tiny database. It's a big database. And there's 2,000 incidences where you got multiple observers watching the UFO go through the atmosphere and crash into the Earth. And when they're going through the atmosphere, where you got multiple observers and you can kind of do some triangulation, the velocities going through the atmosphere run from 5 to 18,000 miles per hour. Now, living here in Southern California, I think a lot of you have had the chance to watch a space shuttle going through the atmosphere and landing in Palmdale. And when it goes through our atmosphere, you see the heat friction. You see the bright glow. When these UFOs go through the atmosphere, there's no heat friction. And there's no sonic boom. When the space shuttle goes through our atmosphere in LA, you hear 2 sonic booms. And they're unmistakable. With the UFOs, no sonic booms. And when you go to the crash site, it's very different than going to a crash site where an aircraft crashes into the ground. In such a case, you go there, you'll find crash debris. You go to the UFO crash site, there's no crash debris, no artifacts, no crash debris, but you will see a crater. The crater can be as deep as 18 inches. And if there's snow, the snow is melted, and the vegetation is consistently damaged. So something real happened to cause the crater, to cause the snow to melt, to cause the vegetation to be damaged. But the fact that there is no debris whatsoever tells us we're dealing with something real that's not physical. Now, we've written a book called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. That's not our title. That's the title the publisher chose. And later on, the publisher told me we would have sold more copies if we called it Lights in the Sky and Little Green Women. But that's the way it goes. But we have a lot of these copies at our headquarters. You can get them. And it's the only book out in print that's been written by Christians. and the only book that actually gives you a scientifically testable hypothesis for the UFO phenomena. And basically our point is that when you look at these 1% residual, when people have close encounters with them, the astronomer Alan Hynek developed this first encounters of the close encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind. They've now got a fourth kind. The fourth kind is not one you want. That's where you get killed by the encounter. But the third kind is where you have injury or you wind up having what's called an abduction experience. My colleague Ken Samples wrote the chapters on abductees. So if you've been abducted, go call him, don't call me. So, what we've noticed is with the close encounters, that's defined as where you're within 500 feet of the UFO, the residual UFO, the 1%. The best you're going to come away with is recurring, terrifying nightmares. And the worst is injury or death. And then close encounters of the second kind is where there's communication between the UFO beings and the human being. And we document in this book is that it's consistently deceptive. In fact, you may have heard of the Urantia book. In some editions, it goes 4,000 pages. It's a big, thick book. But a third of the book, and most of the book is all about these beings coming from other planetary systems, but a third of the content is denying the deity of Jesus Christ. So, and this is a book that was communicated by UFO beings where they had contact with a human being and put the human being into a trance, or in a trance-like state, they wound up typing out the Urantia book. And there's a lot of other examples of that in the UFO phenomena. And we're not the only ones that have written on this. We cite 6 other books that have written by physicists or astronomers who have had a minimum of 10 years experience in processing UFO reports. Probably the one who's had the most experience and has the highest credibility is the French astrophysicist Jacques Vallée. He's been publishing on this for 6 decades now. And he's the one who said, we're dealing with something that's real but not physical. It's interdimensional. They come from other dimensions. They're not part of this universe. But what's interesting is all 6 of these physicists, none of whom are Christians, all agree and that what's behind these residual UFOs, the 1%, is the same thing that's behind witchcraft and the occult and demonology. And they said, we don't know what's behind all that, but it's a one-to-one correspondence between witchcraft, demonology, and these UFOs. And so from a Christian worldview perspective, we are dealing with beings from other dimensions, which the Bible identifies as angels. And the Bible tells us there's 2 categories of angels. They're the righteous angels that are allied with the creator of the universe, and are the unrighteous angels, the fallen angels, the evil angels, what are also referred to as demons. And this is what these other 6 physicists are saying, a one-to-one correspondence between this residual UFOs and what makes up demonology. But we close our book by making the comment, the only way you can have these close encounters with these residual UFOs is if you're inviting the encounters through your occult activities. If you're involved in seances, astrology, or you're involved in some kind of spiritualist cult, that will open the door. You're basically inviting these demons to come into your life, and one of the ways they come into your life is through these UFO phenomena. And part of this, I've actually been to other parts of the world where UFO encounters are much more prevalent than they are here. Much more prevalent in Alaska, for example, than they are here in California. They were extremely prevalent in Soviet Russia. And I spoke 3 times in Soviet Russia before the communists lost control of the country. And the first time I was there, they said, we want you to speak to our scientists. and you can only speak to scientists. If we catch you speaking to a non-scientist, we'll deport you immediately. But they get to pick what you get to speak on. But of the 30 messages I gave on my first trip, half of them were on UFOs. And I found out why. Almost half of these physicists and astronomers and chemists were having experiences with UFOs. But that was a time when the Soviet government was sponsoring research on occult physics. And what I shared with those scientists was this: if you will repudiate your occult activity, turn away from it, and agree with God in prayer that what you were doing was something that doesn't please Him, that will cut the link, and that will be the end of your UFO encounters. And basically, as we say it in the book, anyone, if you're having these kinds of encounters, cut the links, get the occult out of your life. That'll be the end of your encounters. But it works the other way. Invite the occult. If you invite the occult sufficiently in your life, it's guaranteed you will have a UFO encounter. So that's why we say this is a scientifically testable theory we've outlined in this book. Okay, I'm going to invite Jeff to come up here. He's also going to speak on a slightly different aspect of these UFOs and extraterrestrials. And of course, he's written a book on this as well as I have. And when we're done, you can ask us questions in any subject that you choose. Thank you.
I have to say I was a little concerned when he was talking about the close encounters of the third kind, and he goes, my colleague Ken Samples, it sounded like he was going to say, had one of these abductions. But I'm really grateful to know that he didn't do that, because no. So when we're talking about UFOs, I mean, Hugh's done a great job of talking about how do we deal with, what do we actually see and how it's going on. But what I wanted to do is kind of take a little bit of a different tack and kind of address what I see as a general sentiment or the idea that you can move about the universe fairly easily. Because, I mean, if you look at what our culture, we watch Star Wars, we watch Star Trek, the Marvel comic universe, that traveling around the universe is easy. I mean, you just flip on your light, you go to light speed, you start your warp engines, or, you use the Bifrost, whether you're in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm not even entirely sure what a Bifrost is, but somehow it allows you to transport great distances across the universe. And so there's this kind of idea out there that traveling through the universe is relatively straightforward, or if not straightforward, it's just got to develop the technology and we'll get there. And so what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes and give you a sense of the scale of the problem of traveling through the universe. And to do that, if you go back to 1977, we launched the Voyager 1 probe. And that was to go out, looked at Jupiter and Saturn, took some great pictures of that. As it went by Saturn, it went by a moon of Saturn and was kicked out of the solar system. And it's now traveling about 11 miles a second. So it would get me home from here to Glendora in about 2 seconds. I mean, this is moving very quickly. To get from Earth out to the boundary where the sun's magnetic field is no longer the driving influence of what's going on. So just at the boundary of what we would consider interstellar space took over 35 years. Now, if this Voyager 1 probe was traveling towards the closest star, again, 11 miles a second, it would take 80,000 years to get there. Now, it's actually not traveling at that. What it's traveling towards this cool star that has a nice name made of a whole bunch of numbers and letters that really don't mean anything unless you know what catalog it's from. And there happens to be this star that's actually moving towards us. And so the picture I painted is a little bit not accurate, because in about 40,000 years, it will actually be closer to this star than the sun. But so given our current technology, I mean, we may be able to double it or whatever. So instead of 80,000 years, it's only 40,000 years to get to the next closest star. But we're talking about, what that really just says is that space is really, 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 really big. And so, we think, okay, well, maybe if we do X, Y, or Z, it's like there's a huge scale of a problem that we're trying to get at, and it's really difficult to solve. And typically, when we talk about traveling to other planets, we don't talk about our current technology. We talk about technology that we can develop. So given our current technology, we're talking tens of thousands of years to get anywhere other than the sun. And that has no guarantee of whether that closest thing around us actually has any sort of place to live. It just says that's the closest thing. If you now switch that and say, you know what, instead of being able to travel about 11 miles a second, let's move up something closer to maybe a tenth the speed of light. So now to get to Alpha Centauri, which is 4 light years away, that takes about 40 years. So we've solved our time problem of tens of thousands of years. We brought it down within the time scale of a human lifetime, but we've switched one problem for another problem. We've switched a time problem for an energy problem. And to illustrate the energy problem, I forgot to bring my baseball today here, but every now and again, I'll go out and play catch with one of my kids. I've had one son who really liked playing baseball, and so we throw it. And more times than not, if I'm sitting there tossing it around, I'm throwing it something on the order of 30 miles an hour. And once you know how fast the ball is moving, once you know the mass of the ball, which is in units that may make, it's about a little bit about a tenth of a kilogram. Given those two numbers, you can calculate how much kinetic energy the ball has. And for my 30-mile-an-hour throw, it's got about 12 joules. Don't remember what the joules is unimportant. Just remember 12. Because I throw it about 30 miles an hour. If you now go look at a major league pitcher, they throw it 90 to 100 miles an hour. And my 12 joules that I throw increases to 140 joules. Because the kinetic energy goes as the square of the velocity. So we went 3 times up in velocity, we go up almost 10 times in energy. So now we want to talk about not 30 miles an hour or 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour. We want to talk about a tenth the speed of light, which is 30 million meters every second. If you go through and just do all the calculations, your energy is not 12 joules, it's not 140 joules, it's 65 trillion joules. That's a big number. Scale of that number, that's about 1% of the energy output of the United States in an entire year. To get one spacecraft, well, no, this is kind of step it back just a little bit here, because if you got one spacecraft, which it says about 500 kilograms, you can't get much lighter than that. I'm 100 kilograms, so that's like 5 people. Your spaceship is 5 people heavy. You want to make that spaceship travel at a tenth the speed of light. You are now talking about 225 quadrillion joules. Again, we're talking about basically the energy output of the United States, a large fraction or a substantial fraction of the energy output of the United States through an entire year, just to get that one ship up to that speed. And so if you put that out in terms of barrels of oil, I think I calculated it's about 35 million barrels of oil. If you could extract energy 100% efficiently, it would take 225 kilograms of hydrogen that you convert into helium with absolute efficiency, and you're able to extract all that energy. Now, remember, our ship was only 500 kilograms, right? So we've now got half the mass of our ship is just in the fuel, which means I also have to add more fuel to get that, so it's a really hard problem, because 225 kilograms of hydrogen is actually a lot of hydrogen. So we can, if we take our current technology, it's going to take us an incredibly long lifetimes. In fact, you're talking about something similar to the time scale of humanity to get somewhere else. If you say, let's go faster, you now swap your time problem for an energy problem. And remember, we're traveling through space. So as you travel through space, space is very empty, but not completely empty. There's stuff floating around out there. Now, you're traveling a tenth the speed of light. That's an incredible amount of energy. But what happens when you happen to run across that little grain of sand or a couple of hydrogen atoms that are sitting out there? They're moving at you at a tenth the speed of light. They have 1 billion joules of energy, and they're just tearing through your ship. So you're playing a long game of Russian roulette as you're out flying through space. So again, it's not to say this is impossible. I just wanted to give you a sense of the scale of the problem of trying to travel through the universe. You either have this really long time problem, or you have this enormous energy problem, which once you get up to those speeds, there are other problems associated with traveling those speeds, because if you happen to hit anything, it's really problematic. And look, I just find it amazing. The Millennium Falcon has this shield on it that manages to blow all that, just get rid of all that stuff. And the Enterprise has the same thing. And I don't know what happens to Thor as he's going through the Bifrost. Maybe they just incinerate it all while it's going. But, again, in our popular culture, traveling through space is really not that hard. And there's this perception, I think, that if we just keep working our technology, keep solving problems, we'll eventually get it. But I don't think that's just not the right sense of the scale of the problem. We talked about, let's just talk about Star Trek there. If we can warp, you got these warp drives that warp space that allow you to move through space. It kind of solves the going through space real fast problem, because you're actually not. You're warping space. And so you're within your little region of space, you're not traveling that fast, but your bubble is traveling fast. We talk about warping space. We now have gravitational wave detectors that allow us to detect the warping of space and figure out what it takes to do that. Well, if you have a 30 solar mass black hole collide with another 30 solar mass black hole, they collide with one another. They produce something that's a little bit less than 60 solar mass black hole, and about three solar masses goes into pure energy that goes into warping the fabric of space. And it makes these ripples in the fabric of space that are about 100 times smaller than the size of a proton. And so warping space is incredibly difficult to do. It's not like, well, we just have to develop the technology. Again, it takes an enormous amount of energy, which we have this energy problem. And the reason why I highlight that is not to say, wow, it's just impossible to travel through space. But recognize that to say you can travel through space, you're talking about technology that we can't even conceive of at this point to get it done. So if you have something you say, oh, this looks like somebody visiting from outer space, your initial position ought to be one of extreme skepticism, because the technology to make that happen, it's not even just beyond what we can see. It's so far beyond what we can see that I'm inclined to bet that it doesn't exist. Although I've learned never to bet against human ingenuity, because we've done a lot of things that seem like are impossible. So I'm not going to bet against it, but just realize there's a lot of problems there. Now, one thing I did want to point out, we're talking about traveling 4 light years because that's the closest star. There was a colleague of mine over at UCLA, Brad Hansen. He gave a talk and said something that we tend to think this is the way the universe looks all the time. But the reality of it is stars are moving around our galaxy all the time. And right now, the closest star is 4 light years away. But over the span of 1 billion years, stars move a lot, and things actually get close enough that it's maybe 1,000 astronomical units. That's only 10 times further than the Voyager 1 space probe has gone. And so it may be that there are situations that allow humans, or potentially other creatures if God has created them in the universe, that allow them to move around. So we need to realize this is a little bit more complicated picture than just, oh, there's all these problems, is impossible. But I still think anytime you see a claim of things moving around, let's be a little skeptical of that. The one last point I wanted to make is there's another narrative that tends to go along with finding UFOs. And that narrative is that if a genuine UFO, not some spiritual being, but some physical being actually makes it to Earth, that would just rewrite every major religion, and they would all be wrong, because none of them have thought about or can deal with such a scenario. And one of the things I found as I was doing the research for this book is that Christians have thought about this for millennia. I mean, there are documented written records of people talking about this 500, 600, 700 years before Christ came. In fact, I kind of jokingly argue, it wouldn't surprise me that was one of the arguments Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. Are there other creatures out there? Because it seems like such a fascinating topic. The point is this, that when we look at Christianity and how would it handle alien life, or genuine UFOs, genuine other extraterrestrial life, that would be a better term for it. You got to recognize that Christians have thought about this for a long time. Galileo, who's a very prominent Christian, thought that Earth was the only place where life existed. Kepler, an equally devout Christian, thought God had created life on all the different planets out in the universe. And so here you've got 2 Christians at the dawn of the scientific era taking 2 vastly different points on this. And where this actually all plays out is, when you talk about creation, that's an important doctrine. You've got the fall, you've got redemption, the incarnation, you got the redemption, you got the consummation. really where this kind of falls out is the fall and redemption. How does that play out? That's kind of the dominant place in Christian theology where this plays out. Turns out Christians have identified a number of different scenarios where this could work out. On earth, you've got humanity fall, Adam and Eve fell, Christ came, took on, the second person of the Godhead, took on human nature, became human, died on the cross to atone for our sins, rose again, pays for our sins. We can now be restored to fellowship with God, right relationship with God, and live forever in eternity with Him. That's the story that the Bible gives us here on earth. So in thinking about this, people thought, what, maybe Christ goes to another planet and takes on a different nature. So he took on a human nature here. That's in the image of God. But maybe there's other ways Christ could take on an image bearer. Maybe he took on a human nature and a Klingon nature. Again, that would be consistent with theology. Maybe the incarnation here on earth is just a seminal event that atones for all sin throughout the creation. So we actually happen to be in the place where we see God says, hey, this is what happened here. But on some other planet, there's this, hey, my son came and died on this planet here, and that atoned for sin. So maybe that's a possibility. Maybe there's just an entirely different means of redemption that God has that He hasn't revealed to us yet. Or maybe the creatures on that planet fell, but have no means of redemption. Now we think, wow, how could a loving God do? Well, that's effectively what happened with the angelic realm. So it's like there's something about being in the presence of God and rebelling precludes the possibility of redemption. So maybe that's what happened to this. Or maybe those creatures that God created never fell, and so there's no need of redemption. Or, and this is a very likely possibility, one I'm inclined to think, is that we're the only life that God has created in the universe. But if we find life in the universe, really the question I have is, what does that tell me about what God has done? Because most people assume that if we find life, that eliminates Christianity, or that life will tell us, somehow invalidate what Christianity has to say. But if God is who He says He is, when we talk with those ETs, hypothetical ETs, they're going to basically give us the same story we have here. Something very consistent with that, if God is who He says He is, and I'm convinced of that. So as you can tell, I'm kind of excited about this. I could talk for a long time. I think we're going to stop now, and I'm not sure Marge is going to come up and tell us what to do. And I wrote a book about it. Stay here. All right.
And Hugh, if you'll come up, both of you can sit up here. You don't have to stand during the Q&A. I do want to mention that the people on Zoom may also ask questions. If you go into the chat and type your question, then Catherine is going to forward those to me, and I'll read them out to Hugh and Jeff. Now, we have 2 microphones at the back of the room, which we invite any of you who have a question to go to those microphones and ask your question. That's going to be the best, because you can even ask a follow-up today, because there's enough of you that would work. And if you don't want to go to the microphone, but you still want to ask a question, that's what that 3x5 card is for. Just write your question on there and then pass it to the center or to the edge. And Ellen and Chloe, where are you? They're back there. Hold your hand up when cards get to the end of your row, and they will come pick them up and bring them to me. So I think we've got that covered, haven't we? So I think we're all set, and you guys take it away. Raise your hand.
This is a question. Is the microphone on?
I can hear you.
This is a question for Dr. Ross. Genesis 2:10 says a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there parted and became 4 riverheads. That would put Eden up north. But you're saying it's the other way around. How do you get there from this passage?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, it's written in Hebrew, not English. It got translated into English. But what you notice following verse 10, it describes the 4 rivers. And it says the Tigris and the Euphrates flow out of the land of Asher, referring to modern-day Iraq. And then it refers to the Pishon flowing out of the mountainous region of Havilah, and that would be southwestern Arabia. and then it speaks of the Gihon flowing out of the mountains of Kush, which would be the mountains of Ethiopia. And these four rivers come together in the Garden of Eden. So what Genesis 2 is telling us, names the four rivers, and by the way, we can identify all four rivers today. The Tigris and Euphrates flow out of the ice melt of the mountains of Turkey and Armenia, and then the Pishon, the Gihon are dry riverbeds. They were flowing during the last ice age when there was ice to be melting off of the mountains of Kush and Havilah. Right now, those mountains have no snow and no ice on them at all, and so those two rivers are dry riverbeds. But you can see them easily on satellite imagery. You can see the two dry riverbeds. And what caused some scholars consternation is that the mountains of Kush are not in Arabia, they're in Africa. But during the last ice age, there was a land bridge joining Arabia to Eastern Africa. And so you could have the Gihon River literally flowing out of the mountains of Eastern Africa across that land bridge and down into. And if you look at a map, those four rivers actually do come close together, but in a region that today is 200 feet below sea level. It's in the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. And this is the reason why I look at the Garden of Eden event as being an ice age event. Because if it's during an interglacial, it's underwater. But during a glacial period, it's above sea level. And so in that context, when people ask me, well, what's the date for God creating Adam and Eve? Adam and Eve were created sometime during an ice age, most likely during the previous ice age. And the date for when that region would be above sea level would be between 130,000 and 15,000 years ago. That particular region would have been above sea level. At that time, all four rivers would have been flowing because they would have been fed by ice melt and snow melt, and they do meet together in that region in the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. That also helps us identify the land of Nod, because in Genesis 4, it states that the land of Nod is east of Eden. And so that would mean that the land of Nod would be in the plains of southwestern Persia or Iran today. And by the way, please don't go to the land of Nod while questions are being asked today.
Here's a question from Zoom. Is Jeff saying there really are UFOs, as in little green men?
I am not saying there are or there aren't. I'm saying two things. One, if we're going to claim that something is UFO, we've got to solve the problem of how do they get here. Because it's not just, oh, there's a little bit of technology we need to develop and make that possible. There's a huge barrier to traveling through space. So we should be skeptical of any claim. On the other side, as a Christian, I have to ask the question, what if God created other beings? Actually, I guess the question I'm asking is, what if we actually find a genuine extraterrestrial being? What do we do with that? When I first started thinking about this, I thought that was a challenge for Christianity. What I recognize is that Christians have thought about this a lot, and finding extraterrestrials would in no way undermine what the Bible has to say. So my personal position is I don't think there are. It wouldn't surprise me to find out later that God had created some, because God does lots of things that surprise me. So.
Good morning, Dr. Zweerink and Dr. Ross. Thank you for being here. My name is Matthew R. currently of Santa Ana. The questions regarding the expansion of the universe. I asked a similar question to you, Dr. Zweerink, when you were here last time, I think 2 years ago, but I worded it a little bit differently since Dr. Ross is here. So in regards to the latest data collected that explains the expansion of the universe, are any of the successive derivatives of the position with respect to time of the expansion of the universe negative?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to are measurements of nearby galaxies, where we see that the galaxies are coming towards us rather than away from us. And that's expected because the gravitational influences between galaxies that are nearby actually dominate the expansion velocity of the universe. But once you get beyond the local group region, what you discover is that all the galaxies have velocities that move away from us. Because at that point, then the expansion of the universe velocity begins to dominate the local effects of gravitational influences.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe let me put it this way. So I understand that the expansion is accelerating currently.
Yes.
But is the derivative of the acceleration zero or negative? In other words, is there a point of inflection?
Yeah, I get it. There's a debate going on today amongst astronomers about whether dark energy is governed by a single constant or two or more constants. And that debate is not yet settled. Having read the literature on this, most astronomers feel, based on their measurements, that it seems likely that it's based on a single constant. But we really need the James Webb Telescope, which has now been pushed back to November launch. And it'll take a couple of years of measurements by the James Webb Telescope to really pin down whether or not dark energy is governed by a single constant or multiple constants. But either way, you have the universe expanding more rapidly in the local time than when you look back billions of years. Because dark energy predicts that the universe will expand more and more rapidly as the universe continues to get older and older. And gravity actually slows down the acceleration of the universe, but as the universe expands, gravity becomes weaker. And yes, there is an effort to try to determine the inflection point, the point where dark energy dominates the effect of local gravity. And right now, the best measurement for that inflection point is 7 billion years ago. The error bar on that is plus or minus a billion. And again, the James Webb Telescope is going to be needed to get that error bar smaller than plus or minus a billion. And some of the older papers say the inflection point was 5 or 6 billion. And there's still one paper out there published just 6 months ago that's pushing for a date of about 5.5 billion years ago. But I'd say if you had pushed me to pin down a number, most of the measurements are suggesting 7 as opposed to 5.5. But again, the error bars are big.
Okay, here's another question. Could we travel faster if we don't have gravity slowing us down? If yes, does that not speed up the timeline?
So of all the stuff I was talking about, that assumes we're out in interstellar space. And so for all intents and purposes, you have no gravitational pull. I mean, you're always in the gravitational influence of something. But if you get far enough away from the sun and it becomes a small enough effect that you're basically traveling through space. So all of the numbers and the calculations I gave presume that you're not dealing with gravitational fields. So whether there's gravity or not doesn't influence any of the numbers and the calculations I gave. So.
Okay, so this question is for Dr. Ross. So Wikipedia says that the ancient Israelites envisioned a universe made up of a flat, disc-shaped earth floating on water, heaven above, underworld below. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the biblical cosmology in Genesis 1 against the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies as we find in the Enuma Elish, and the differences in interpretation that you might have versus the interpretation of someone like Michael Heiser, who views Genesis 1 as a myth critique?
Yeah, very good question. And hey, if you're really interested in that subject, I've been teaching on that for the past 6 weeks in my Sunday Paradoxes class. And it's a Zoom class, anybody can join. And I'll actually be teaching, but tomorrow what I'm going to be doing, and the class runs from 10:30 to 12:30, the teaching times from 10:45 till about 11:20. Tomorrow I'm actually going to be going through the entire Bible and look up every text where it uses the word rakai and the verb form RQ, and actually address this whole question that's been raised. Does the Bible actually teach that there's this solid dome over a flat Earth. And I'm basically going to be making the point that if you actually look at every usage of the word Rakei, you can actually prove that the Bible is referring to the atmosphere and the celestial sphere above. And I'm actually going to be citing a long paper written by two theologians, and this goes back a few years, and it's online. In fact, tomorrow I'll actually be giving you the link where you can actually read the whole paper for yourself, where they basically make the point that no one in the ancient Near East had that belief. Now, what you do find is fantasy literature where they're proposing that, but it's not in their historical or their scientific literature. And actually, the origin of this idea that the ancient Near Eastern peoples believed in this has its origin in the year 1805. So it actually comes out of the milieu of a higher criticism theology, where they impose this idea that the ancients believed this. And so the literature citing this is, 17th, 18th century. But if you actually go into the ancient literature, you cannot find anyone there who believed that the earth was flat or there was a metal dome above it. And what I'll be speaking about, not tomorrow, but a couple of weeks from now in the class, is what the ancients actually knew about science. And so, for example, what you'll discover is that all the peoples around the Israelites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, they all knew that the earth was a sphere. Matter of fact, they all took steps to measure the diameter of the earth. And the most accurate measurement was accurate to 1% precision. That's fairly trivial to do. Just look at the shadow of the sun as it goes down deep wells at different locations on the earth. And the ancient peoples did that. They were able to determine the earth was a sphere. They also had come up with geometry to tell them the distance to the moon and the distance to the sun. Now, they were off by a factor of 2, but only a factor of 2. So they knew that the sun was approximately 50 million miles away. They thought it was about half the distance that we think it is today. But they knew it was far away. Far enough away, it couldn't be situated on a metal dome a few miles above the earth. They knew it was much more distant than that. Same thing with the moon. And also they noted that during a lunar eclipse, you get a curved shadow on the moon. So it was confirming evidence that the earth indeed had to be a sphere. And likewise, in a solar eclipse, they could see that circular shadow. And so again, that told them that the other bodies were also spherical bodies. They actually tried to measure the distances of the stars with their geometric tools, and they couldn't do it. And that's what told them the stars had to be extremely distant, because their methods that they used to measure the distance to the sun were not able, with naked eye observations, to determine the distance. So they knew the stars were far away. In fact, if you read their literature, they said the stars must be bodies like the sun, because the distances are so great, and even though they look dim to us because of the distances, they're most likely bodies like the sun. And so what I'm going to be critiquing in the paradoxes class is that we're suffering from 21st century hubris, where we think we're the only ones that really know about cosmology. We're the only ones that know about the structure of the solar system. And the ancients were stupid. In fact, what I find in the writings of people like Michael Heiser and John Walton and Tremper Longman III, they also assume that the ancients didn't care about science. Well, the truth is, all human beings care about science. Little children care about science. Anyone here as a parent realizes when their children were 3 and 4 years of age, they were asking science questions. We humans are designed to do that. God made us curious about the realm around us. And this is true of all generations of humanity. And because they had the intelligence that they did, they were able to develop the tools. Now, they were limited. They didn't have the technological tools we have. And moreover, they lacked the mathematics. There's this myth in the 21st century that the ancients were all geocentrists. They believed that the earth was the center. And, people have a wrong idea of Copernicus. They think Copernicus was the one that discovered heliocentrism. If you actually read the history of Copernicus, he left his home Poland and made several trips to Italy. And he went to Italy in order to look at the manuscripts of the ancient literature, because the Italian libraries, with the burning of the library in Alexandria, Egypt, it was the Italian libraries that had the best collection of those ancient manuscripts. He read those ancient manuscripts and discovered that centuries before Christ, the ancients had figured out the sun was the center of the solar system and that the planets revolved around the sun. But they lacked the mathematics to be able to determine the future positions of planets with the mathematical tools they had. And so that's when you have Ptolemy, for example, the Greek who was in Egypt, saying, well, we can use these epicircles. If we assume that the earth is the center, we can actually use that mathematical tool to determine the future positions of planets. And it works. Now, later on, another 10 centuries, we came up with algebra. And with algebra, we now had the tools to determine the future positions of planets from a sun center perspective rather than earth center perspective. And so it's a myth that the ancients believed that the earth was the center of the solar system. They simply lacked the mathematical tools to do the kind of calculations they wanted from that perspective. Anyway, if you're interested, I'm teaching on that every Sunday in the paradoxes. I'm also writing a book where I will be dealing with what I call accommodationism. This idea that the Old Testament writers, the Holy Spirit was simply accommodating their mistaken scientific ideas, and hence these mistaken scientific ideas got into passages like the book of Genesis. But tomorrow I'll be actually doing a word study on RTB and basically making the point that the modern translations that say instead of there was an expanse over the earth where rain clouds formed, an expanse where the stars exist, they're actually translating it, there was this metal vault over the earth. Now, what I'll be showing tomorrow, not until 2011 was there any Bible translation that ever translated the word RTB as a vault or a dome. That's only happened in the 21st century. You can go back 1,000 years when they were doing Bible manuscripts in Latin, or the first one that was done in English, or what you see in the ones that were done in Switzerland. None of them translated it that way. Only in the year 2011 has it happened. Unfortunately, the 3 best-selling Bibles in English all translate it as a vault or dome. But I'm going to be arguing tomorrow that that's a mistaken translation. And it's actually something that's been inputted into the Bible by theologians who take an accommodationist worldview. Hey, if you want to read more on this, and this also refers to the question that came up first about the Garden of Eden, you'll see it in the book over there, Navigating Genesis, where you'll see thorough citations to the theological literature. But thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, here's another question. Why did God write the Bible such that it's so hard to understand?
I guess I'm not entirely sure behind what's behind that, but I would, as I look at Scripture, it's actually very easy to understand the basic message of what Scripture has to say. I mean, Genesis 1 and 2 is creation. There's the fall of humanity. There's a history of what happened. Who was Abraham? The nation of Israel. I mean, it's not hard to figure out that. And you got to Jesus, and there's going to be a new heaven and new earth. And so the basic picture is actually pretty easy to understand. But what so I'm wondering if the difficulty is like, okay, so how do we understand scientifically what's going on in Genesis 1? I mean, Revelation seems to have a lot of imagery and figural language. How do we figure out what's going on there? To me, what I understand, or how I look at that is like, you've got this infinite, omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful being communicating his story with humanity. And so if he's doing that, there's going to be an aspect where the story, it's easy to tell what the story is, and we will never be able to exhaust the details of what's fascinating to discover out of it. And so I'm wondering if what's difficult is actually just a reflection of, as we understand this about God, there's still more to dig in and go deeper. We find that same sort of thing when we look at science. We ask, okay, we got the 4 fundamental laws of nature: gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force. How do they interact? How does that transform into chemistry? How does chemistry transform into biology? There's a level, the basic picture, it's taken us a while, but we kind of have the basic picture. But there is no end to the level of detail of fascinating stuff to discover. I mean, dark energy was not even something on people's radar for most of the last century, but yet now we found it and we're trying to figure out what in the world it is, and we spent 20 years and still don't really have any more clue yet. But 150 years down the road, we're still going to have this fascinating, fun question to answer, because we're never going to exhaust what there is to know. So the basic picture, I think, is pretty easy to get out of Scripture, but there's no limit to the amount of interesting, fascinating detail that we can learn, because God's Scripture is a revelation of himself. And so we're never going to exhaust what there is to know about God. Why would we expect Scripture to be, we could understand everything easily? There's obviously going to need to be a lot of digging in and understanding, because I think that's part of what we're going to be doing in eternity. So I would be curious to know what in there is the assessment of why is Scripture so hard. Probably, I may or may not have a follow-up to that, but I think that what is hard is an opportunity for us to know God in a way that would be almost impossible to know were it not challenging for us to dig in and understand it.
Yeah, and I would add this: it's easy to get the main message. It's hard to get everything that God intended to communicate through it. And keep in mind, it's less than 900,000 words. So that to me was evidence that this book has to be inspired by the Holy Spirit. Look at all the content that got squeezed into less than 900,000 words. Because when I looked at the Quran or looked at the Hindu Vedas, it's like, these are certainly really vacuous books. You read them once and you're done with it. You read the Bible, you can read it 30, 40 times and never get everything out of it that's there. But the main message, really simple. Anyone can get the main message.
Okay. This question is on UFOs. It's for Dr. Ross. If UFOs are non-physical entities, what are fighter pilots seeing on radar? Wouldn't radar waves pass through it instead of bounce off them?
Yes, well, this is something we document in this book here, is that when you're looking at the residual UFOs, and keep in mind that some of the things that pilots are seeing are bits of paint that are peeling off their aircraft, and because of the velocity, it lights up. So some of the stuff they're seeing is natural phenomena. Some of what they're seeing is not natural phenomena. But what's interesting is that the ones that are seen and non-natural are those that have some occult activity in their background. And there you got to be careful, because sometimes you talk to a UFO contactee and you discover they really don't have anything to do with the occult. However, their father did, or their grandfather did. And demons can work through generations, which is why you see King David, when he took the throne, confessing the sins of his parents, basically to break the link between generations behind him and his authority that he would have over the nation. Now, you had another point, so get to the microphone again. What was your other point?
Well, I'm referring specifically about the videos recently released.
Okay, the radar stuff. Yes, I get it.
By the Pentagon, where fighter pilots are tracking on their local radar, within their airplane, where they're tracking this object that is making these unusual movements, physically impossible movements.
Right.
If those were the non-physical entities, wouldn't radar pass through them as opposed to bounce off them? I mean, they would not be able to see them.
Okay. Yeah, this is also addressed here. We make the point that you've got these pilots, and it's not just fighter pilots. This has also been reported by some of the NASA astronauts, where they see these objects going at extremely high velocities and doing a sharp right angle turn, or going at a high velocity and stopping. No physical object can survive that. I mean, we can only handle a maximum of about 9 or 10 Gs. But this is way beyond that. And if it's a physical object, it would shatter if it were to make that kind of acceleration change. And what's interesting is that sometimes these phenomena do show up on radar. Sometimes they show up in cameras where you got a photographic image. Sometimes the pilot sees it. Sometimes it shows up in infrared. But where you got multiple detecting instruments, it shows up on some, but never all. If it's a physical object, it will show up on all the detecting instruments that are there. And this is something we document here, is that when you look at these residual UFOs, there are cases where it shows up on camera, but not radar, or radar and not camera. Or the pilot sees it, but the camera doesn't pick it up. And so this would be, again, evidence that we're dealing with something that's real, but not physical.
Well, I would, one thing, at least some of the new videos that have come out, I've been looking at those a little bit, and I was kind of expecting something a little bit more substantial to come out, given the hype that was kind of built up to it. But one of the things that I can't get around in analyzing this is, you think a lot of times this happens in the context of military or something like that going on. The idea that we could project an image to fool somebody, that technology strikes me as within our grasp and exactly the sort of thing you would want to play around with. So having these things that show up real clearly in some way, it's at least plausible. And I'm inclined to think this is probably a lot of the more recent ones, that there are enemies of whoever playing with technology to project images. The fact that they show up in one kind and not another, that is symptomatic of that sort of stuff, because you can fool one sort of signal but not another. And so, I get, Hugh alluded to this. There's a lot of things that go into establishing this is a UFO or something that's genuinely real. I wouldn't discount the undisclosed military technology that almost certainly exists.
Okay, thank you.
We have several questions on global warming, such as, is there any real proof of global warming? And how much is mankind contributing to global climate change? Will eliminating fossil fuels solve the problem?
Okay, yeah, I'm the one who's written a book on global warming. It's called Weathering Climate Change. I do see it over there, so you can pick that up. And what I document in chapter 2 is, number one, global warming is real. Now, it's real on a global scale. It's not real on a regional scale. Our best global warming models predict, for example, that it's going to get colder in Eastern Europe, and it's going to get colder in northeastern US. In fact, we've been observing that. The winters there in both places have been getting more severe. And to a lesser degree, they're saying it's likely it's going to get colder in northeastern China. But other parts of the world are going to get much warmer. The Canadian North, for example, is warming at a rate 5 times greater than the global average. Now, the other question is, and incidentally, 10 years ago, we did not have, good global temperature data that would go back 10,000 years. I waited to bring the book out until I knew we were going to have this emerging temperature data. and basically a report on work that was done about 2 years ago, where they used 74 temperature proxies from all over the world. And for the first time, we're able to come up with an indisputable global mean temperature record for the past 10,000 years. And basically demonstrated, number one, our climate is about 4 times more stable than we thought it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they were saying it was stable to plus or minus 2 degrees centigrade over the past 9,500 years. We now know it's stable to about plus or minus 0.6 degrees, so much more stable. And that's one reason why we've been able to catapult our civilization and technology at the rate we have, because of how extremely stable it is. And you may have heard talk about, well, there was this warming period during the Middle Ages, and that this warming period is greater than the warming we see now. Well, these 74 temperature proxies have basically reduced the effect of the Middle Ages warming by a factor of 3. And so at most, the global mean temperature, and it's not the global mean, it's the local mean over Europe, went up a half degree centigrade. They used to say it went up 1.2 degrees centigrade. That's now been chopped down to a half degree. So for example, the warming we've seen over the past 70 years is 1.1 degrees. So that's more than double anything we saw in the Middle Ages. So this idea that we're seeing today is not unprecedented. That's been taken away by this latest temperature record over the past 10,000 years. The other thing that I think needs to be addressed is this the result of human activity or natural activity? Now, there are natural phenomena that warm the planet. There are natural phenomena that cool the planet. But the two biggest natural factors that govern whether we're in a warming trend or a cooling trend is the changing tilt of the rotation axis of the Earth. It varies by about plus or minus 1.2 degrees. And when it tilts over, the planet gets warmer. When it tilts back up, it gets cooler. The other effect that determines temperature variations is the shape of our orbit about the sun. And when the orbit gets more elliptical, we get colder. And when it gets more circular, we get warmer. Well, both of those cycles for the past 8,000 years have been cooling the planet. So we should be a whole lot colder than we are right now, because the natural cycles are both operating together to cool the planet. What happened about 10,000, 11,000 years ago, climate stability came into effect for the first time because the norm is climate instability. During the entire ice age cycle of the past 2.6 million years, the global mean temperature has been jumping up and down by 10 degrees centigrade on time scales of a millennium or less. And this explains why humans during the last ice age weren't able to launch global civilization. The climate was way too unstable. But the moment the climate stabilized, you have this catapult in civilization. It's called the Neolithic Revolution. And what happened with the Neolithic Revolution is people began to go scale up their domestic agriculture. So they were growing crops and specializing and growing thousands of acres of a specialized crop. And they were specializing in animal husbandry, where they would now have a flock of 10,000 goats or 1,000 cows. Both of those effects work to warm the planet. So human activity, cutting down trees, creating pasture land, growing rice, being able to domesticate the cows and making them more productive, those all work to warm the planet. And the warming from human activity counterbalance the natural cooling. So as a document in Weathering Climate Change, the reason we've had such a stable climate over the past 9,000 years is that the human activity almost perfectly balanced the natural cooling, stabilizing the temperature of planet Earth. What's happened in the past 70 years is that technology has advanced at such an incredibly accelerated rate that the human activity is now greater than the natural cooling. And so over the past 70 years, we've been in a warming period where the global mean temperature has gone up by about 1.1 degrees. But for example, there's now papers published saying carbon dioxide may not be the primary factor warming the global mean temperature. This is particularly evident over Siberia and Finland, Sweden, and Canada, that now what's considered to be the greatest warming factor is black carbon soot. Black carbon soot falls on the snow and ice of Canada and Siberia and Lapland and causes that to absorb a lot more heat. And so there's now a big push. Can we, and by the way, they now know the source. One reason why Canada is warming up 5 times faster than the rest of the world, it's getting the heaviest load of black carbon soot. And they now have stations situated. And I've got a blog. If you look at my Today's New Reason to Believe blog, I actually have one written relatively recently where I talk about that black carbon soot. And they got stations all over Siberia and Canada that now have been able to identify where that soot's coming from. It's coming from the factories and the energy plants of India and China. And the weather patterns move that black carbon soot from India and China and dump it on Siberia and Canada, explaining why. And actually that effect is probably greater than the carbon dioxide or the methane that's being released. But hey, if you want the latest, you can go over there and get the book, Weather and Climate Change. And incidentally, I encourage all of you, go to reasons.org and look at the blogs that are being produced by Jeff, myself, by Ken Samples, by Fuzz Rana. We do our best to keep you up to date with the latest revelations on the frontiers of the book of nature to guide you into greater confidence in the book of Scripture and the Christian faith.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you for your presentation today, and I unfortunately don't have any good questions on UFOs today, but my question has to do with human evolution. I've read a fairly substantial portion of your literature, and I haven't been able to narrow this one down, and I know there's different organizations like BioLogos and Discovery Center that have slightly differing views on this, but I want to get your feedback on this, I guess. My name is Ron, by the way. So when I open a Bible, and granted I'm reading the English version, so I'm not sure what the Hebrew's saying or what the intonations are there. When I open a Bible in English, the way the wording seems to be in Genesis 2, is that God took Adam from some sort of existing human stock, or it's possible that he took, it says he formed him of the dust of the ground, which could be instantaneous or could be over a long period of time, whatever. I guess what I'm asking is it possible from RTB's perspective that we are looking at Adam and Eve coming from an existing stock of humans? Or is it more likely in your reading that what we're looking at is that Adam and Eve were indeed the absolute first human beings? Or could there have been humans before the humans in the Garden of Eden that were created in God's image?
Well, you're correct that there's a debate going on. In fact, we participated in a 2 views debate with BioLogos on this very subject. And the book is in our catalog, so you can get that. But our position is that indeed all of humanity is descended from one man and one woman, namely Adam and Eve. And we would argue from a biblical perspective, you need to look at more than just Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Look at all 66 books of the Bible. And so, for example, you only have to read on into Genesis 4 and 5, and it tells us that Eve is a mother of every human being. So it identifies her as a progenitor of the whole human race. You go to the book of Acts, and it says all nations came from one man, the one man Adam. And, we've been in the dialogue with the BioLogos scientists and theologians now for 15 years. But throughout those 15 years, they've been very frank with us in saying their biggest biblical problem is Romans 5 and the whole doctrine of original sin. And so I think this is what's significant, this debate over Adam and Eve as a progenitor of all humanity actually has far-reaching theological implications. And this is now being recognized by theistic evolutionists and evolutionary creationists. What do we do with Romans 5 through 8, which talks about the fact that all of us are sinners because we have inherited sin through the rebellion of Adam in the Garden of Eden? And so they're wrestling with that. So I find that encouraging that they admit that that is a significant theological challenge to their view. But then they cite the scientific evidence where they say genetics says we have to come from a population. We can't come from just two. But Fazal Rana and I, for example, have been citing research papers written by physical anthropologists, none of whom are Christians. They're not even theists. But they acknowledge, based on their study of genetics, that it's impossible to derive an ancestral population from the genetic diversity, not only in the human species, but in any mammalian species. And they're basically saying genetics simply is not an adequate tool to derive an ancestral population. And it was Ann Jeanette Roberts that explained to us, too, that, when a woman is born, she is born with all of her eggs intact. And it's certainly within the realm that when God created Eve, he created her with distinct genetic eggs, with DNA distinctiveness in each of her eggs. And, from a biblical perspective, that would make sense because you see no command in Genesis against brothers marrying their sisters. You do in Exodus, but not in Genesis. And that would imply that there was genetic diversity within the first humans. And one of the easiest way to do that is for God to create Eve with genetically distinct eggs. So that's kind of the realm of the debate. It's much more complex than that. And also, our theologians dived into this. So again, I would recommend the Two Views book we did with BioLogos. We also did a 4 Views book called 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design, where 4 of us, the president of BioLogos, the president of the Discovery Institute, the president of Answers in Genesis, and myself as the president of Reasons to Believe, we did a 4-way debate. And a lot of the debate was focused on human origins. And that book is much more accessible for lay people than the Two Views book. But if you want the technical details, I'd recommend the Two Views book.
And that's available on at your organization?
It is. It might even be over there. I don't know whether they have it there or not.
Great.
But it is definitely available through our reasons.org store.
So I did just want to make one comment, because you mentioned, could there be an ancestral population? And our position at Reasons to Believe, and at least partially defends this way, is that, when you look in Genesis 1, God created the universe, God created living organisms, and then God created humanity. But there's this odd description of that humans are created and made. And so, it kind of leads to that, what does the dust of the ground mean? That part of our position is that there's something unique about humanity. It may well be, at least I think you would agree with this, and if not, tell me, but that there's this possibility that God may have used some sort of physical processes to build something akin to the human body, but then did something to modify it to make humanity, and that was Adam and Eve, the first people. So there may be a physical connection in some sense, but there's clearly a special created aspect that Adam and Eve were the first humans. Accurate summary, or at least possible?
Yes, it is. And what you'll see in Genesis 1, and I give an exegetical analysis of this in Navigating Genesis, you see the same thing for the birds and mammals. When God creates the sea mammals and the birds and creation day 5, it uses the word bara and the word asa, translated create and make. So it's making the point that with respect to the soulish animals, there's something about them that God supernaturally constructed, but was not brand new. The physical bodies of the birds and mammals were not brand new. There were animals before them that had that. But what was brand new about them was their soulish characteristics, their capacity to relate to a spiritual being, namely us human beings. And likewise, when you get to creation day 6, it uses the same double verb, that God made human beings and he created human beings, implying there's something about us that God supernaturally made, because the word asa requires God's supernatural intervention. But it's kind of like we human beings constructing a 747. It takes a human to pull that together, but we're using natural resources to do that. And so our physical bodies are not brand new. But what's brand new about us is the spirit that God put within us. So that's why you see the two verbs. And if you go to Genesis 2, it uses a third verb, yatsar. And the verb yatsar in Hebrew means a combination of the making, the manufacturing, and the creating. So in that sense, Jeff is on target. God definitely was using supernatural means to bring about us human beings, even our physical bodies. And there was something that was totally brand new, namely the spirit within us, which allows us to form a relationship with a higher being. So it's just like the birds and mammals were given the capacity to form a relationship with a higher species. We were given the capacity to form a relationship with a higher being. We would also argue that even the bipedal primates are the products of special creation. And the reason why is brand new research coming out, for example, that the Neanderthals likely had a population that hit a maximum of 8,000. One paper says 15,000. But if you've got 15,000 Neanderthals, field studies tell us that any mammal species with a body size greater than 3 kilograms will go extinct before it can evolve. And especially with a population level that low, there's no way they're going to evolve. And evidence for that, the most ancient bones we have for the Neanderthals about 200,000 years ago, we can't see any difference between their bone structure and the bone structure of the most recent Neanderthals, which comes in at about 45,000 years. We see the same evidence for Homo erectus. And what's interesting there is the earliest Homo erecti go back 2 million years, the most recent about 250,000 years, but again, we can't see any change in the fossil structure over that period of time. And likewise, there's emerging evidence. Their populations were greater than 15,000, but likely were not greater than 100,000. And again, with a population level that low, they're not going to evolve. And what you'll see in Navigating Genesis, there's actually a spiritual reason why God created a dozen distinct species of bipedal primates over the past 6.5 million years. I don't have time to get into the details, but it is in the book.
And okay, so that's Navigating Genesis and
Navigating
the
Genesis,
literature.
right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Could you just clarify that a little bit about making man from some existing material? There's a difference between making man from an existing primate and making man from the dust of the ground.
Right. When it uses the verb asa, it's basically saying it's going to take some intelligent supernatural agency to pull this together. It's akin, as I mentioned, to us human beings taking iron, aluminum, and copper ore and different plastics or oils and putting together a jumbo jet airline. It's not going to happen by a tornado whipping through these minefields. It's going to take intelligent agency. And therefore, when it uses the verb asa, it's basically saying we're not the product of a common descent with the chimpanzees. This is not some natural process. Yes, we're not brand new. We're made of stardust. But it takes a God to take the elements from that stardust and put them together, personally manufacture them into the bodies that make up us human beings. And again, I think we have more than adequate scientific evidence that that must be the case. In fact, if Fuzz has written a lot on this, I would commend to you his articles you see online. That when you look at the history of the bipedal primates, we don't see what you would predict from a common descent perspective, that the cranial size of the brain goes up linearly. It does this instead. Or likewise, the bipedal capability goes up linearly. It does this instead. The most recent bipedal primate has a brain size that's only 25% of a human being, as one of the least bipedal of the bipedal primates. So it's going in the wrong direction for common descent. What is going in the right direction is if you look over the past 6 million years, the bipedal primates progressively get more capable of using tools to hunt large-bodied bird and mammal species. And that's just a little hint of what's in Navigating Genesis, that God purposely created these different species of bipedal primates basically to prepare the large-bodied bird and mammal species for the onslaught of the super predators, namely as human beings. And evidence for that is when we super predators came into Australia, we quickly wiped out 94% of the large-bodied bird and mammal species that existed there. But Australia is a continent that had no bipedal primate species that predated human beings. The extinction rate in sub-Saharan Africa was only 4.5% when humans went into that part of the world. But that was also part of the world that had at least 10 of the 12 different species of bipedal primates that preceded us. So God was basically training these large bird and mammal species. When you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, run. Don't go towards them, run away. And the ones in Africa ran away, the ones in Australia did not. They ran towards the humans and got wiped out.
Dr. Ross or Jeff, whichever wants to answer this, what can you expound on or elaborate on what the residual UFOs have to do with demonic activity? What is the correlation there? What's the connection?
Okay, what's the connection between these residual UFOs and demons? Mm-hmm. Well, we argue in Lights in the Sky, Little Green Men, this has always been with us. It's not something that's unique to our time. But Thutmose III, 3,000 years ago, recorded his sighting of a UFO. And they don't always appear as flying saucers or dirigibles or Foo Fighters or fast-moving spacecraft. That's the last 150 years. They've also appeared as leprechauns in Ireland. So they can appear in multiple forms. Angelic beings have the power to appear in whatever physical form they want. So, for example, there are people involved in the occult that wind up getting visits from their dead relatives. It's not their dead relative visiting them. It's an angelic being taking the form of their dead relative. And they can mimic the voice, they can mimic the body, they can mimic a flying saucer, they can mimic a dirigible, they can mimic a leprechaun. They have that kind of power. But we're convinced that we're dealing with the evil angels, not the righteous angels, for two reasons. When you look at the residual UFO database, we see persistent deception. They're never telling the truth. They're not even telling the truth when it comes to the fact that they say, we're from the surface of Venus. That's the story they told 100 years ago, before people realized how hot it is on the surface of Venus. Before that, they were saying they were from the backside of the moon. But when people realized there's not much atmosphere in the back of the moon, they changed their story. So the fact that we see them consistently changing their story, now they're claiming to be from another planetary system. And the information they give us always has some accuracy to it, but never perfect accuracy. And again, this is a mark of deception. They'll give you a little bit of truth in order to get you to believe a lie. And then particularly, why are they so focused on denying the deity of Jesus Christ? We see this consistently in the UFO encounters of the close kind. When people claim to get a message, the message always has a deceptive spiritual component to it. So I think this kind of gives you an idea of their agenda and of who's behind it, and why are they so motivated to get their contactees to commit suicide. And again, from a demonic perspective, if we can get a human being to kill themselves before they give their lives to Jesus Christ, then they think they've won one for their master. So it's that kind of data that I think persuades us we're dealing with the fallen angels. And as I mentioned, we're not alone. Every single book I know of that's been written by scientists where they draw on at least 10 years of personal experience in researching this draws the same conclusion.
No.
How about now?
Yes.
Would it be correct to say that reality is unique, single-valued, meaning that at any one time there's only one unique reality, not multiple realities?
That would kind of depend on which version of quantum mechanics is correct. No, I think in general, yes, that's the simplest, most straightforward way to look at it. I do think, you know, there's kind of multiple flavors of what exactly that question means, but I would say there's this created realm that God has made, but there's the spiritual realm that's beyond this. And so I don't think saying there's a unique single-valued reality excludes something beyond this physical reality, then I think that's not consistent. When you deal with quantum mechanics, one thing that shows up is that there can be different, or depending on which interpretation of quantum mechanics you like, you particularly favor, and there's no way to experimentally distinguish between them. Some of those interpretations say that there is a single valued reality, and some say you end up with dual realities. And so that's a little more complicated. Is there any way to get a follow-up to what they mean by is it single valued reality?
We'll ask him and see if he texts us
We'll
in and get in.
All right, very good.
Put him online.
Yeah, because it's just kind of a very open-ended question of what that could actually mean. So
we have a question over here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. So I would like to know, why does Jupiter have 63 moons?
Hi, Rebecca. I got to say, I love your name. That's one of my daughter's names. So I think your parents did a great job naming you.
Thank you.
So when planets form, so I'm going to give you the how do planets form, and that because that's the answer to why Jupiter has so many moons. Is that when planets form, there's this big, huge cloud of dust and gas, and it collapses for various reasons. And in the center, that center part of the cloud becomes the star. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets put in there. It gets hot enough, ignites nuclear fusion, and provides the radiation that warms up the rest of the solar system. Out around the star, there's all of this other gas. It kind of collapses down and forms a disk of material. And in that disk, sometimes clumps of things will get together and start growing larger. And then the last phase of planet formation is where big clumps of stuff collide with one another, and you end up making planets. Now, sometimes a lot of those things that are left over are big enough that instead of actually going in and colliding, they just end up orbiting around. And so Jupiter, because it's so massive, has collected a lot of those sorts of things. And so it's got 4 moons that are about the size of Earth's moon, and then it's got, like I said, 63. I think last time I checked, it seems to kind of go back and forth. Saturn actually has more moons than Jupiter. They're both right in the mid-60s category. And so it's just part of the way planets form is that the big planets that have a lot of hydrogen and helium in them, they also collect up a bunch of things that end up orbiting and make moons.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome.
We know there are variations in the earliest manuscripts we have of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. While these variations, which are mostly scribal glosses, are minor, there are a few significant, such as in Genesis 4 and John 7. How should we think about these variations in light of God's sovereignty?
Want to take that one?
Well, I mean, so one of the things this highlights, and particularly, I grew up in a background where you went to church, and there's kind of this idea that the Bible just came down from on high, and it was decided, oh yes, clearly this is Scripture. And the reality of it is, there's a process by which people decided what was Scripture. And so, in that inspiration, I am convinced that God inspired the authors to pen the words that they did. And God also inspired the process by which the people decided which versions or what books went into Scripture and what's the correct way of saying. In a process, you're going to have variations. I don't know exactly the resolution to what those. I'd have to go back and look in a little more detail. But I think it's very important to remember there's a process that came into this. And given, what did you say, 900,000 words? 90,000 words?
880,000.
880,000. I'll call that 900,000.
Okay.
900,000 words, and to have a relatively few places where there's kind of variation, that's a pretty remarkable process that we end up with something so clean. And by and large, those tend to happen not where the central message is as well. And so, given what I know about who God is, how he's revealed himself, and the process he used that we use to come up with what Scripture is, the fact that there are a few of these things that are a little difficult actually strikes to me as arguing for the robustness of the process. And again, part of the fun part of figuring out what are some of those details and how do we understand them. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that or a different way.
Yeah,
of looking
usually
at that.
the two texts I hear most frequently is John 8 and Mark 16, at the end of John 8 and Mark 16. But on almost every English translation, it'll give you a little footnote saying some manuscripts include these verses and some don't. And as you look at those passages, there's nothing significant that's at stake if you decide to drop those texts or include those texts. I do love the one at the end of Mark 16, which says you can eat poison and it won't hurt you if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, which means, hey, if you get tempted to eat a cookie once in a while, maybe don't worry about it.
I always thought that was strychnine, is what we were talking about.
Well, I've been accused of putting little signs there by our treats at
That's
the
a fair
office by
point.
saying, hey, Mark 16 says stay away from this stuff.
Well, so your comments actually raised another point. It's like the inerrancy goes to the original manuscript. And what this is also a reflection of is that we don't, in those instances, the original manuscript isn't there. And so there have been some variations. The question is, how do we resolve that? And it may very well be over time, we'll actually get a better resolution to it. New manuscripts which will point to it, or maybe or a more ancient manuscript.
You want to read
part of that's just the fun of making, of validating what we have. And again, I think it argues to the robustness of the process rather than taking away from it.
If you want a good source, there's a book written by the theologian F.F. Bruce on the manuscripts. And he makes the point, one of the arguments for the divine inspiration of the Old New Testament is how many manuscripts we have. So, for example, of the New Testament, 16,500 manuscripts that date earlier than the 5th century AD, and how remarkably similar those manuscripts are. So there's no other piece of literature that's got that kind of weight of manuscript evidence. And it says, with that many manuscripts, you will get a few minor variations. And that also makes the point that God intended that the Old and New Testament would be well preserved. And, Marge was making a comment about the Old Testament, get these scribal errors. Well, if you actually look at these old manuscripts, the scribal errors are recorded in the margin because when they were making copies, and you've probably heard that in the New Testament, they talk about the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes were the ones that were commissioned to make copies of the Old Testament manuscripts. And the way they would make copies, they would get a young man who had good handwriting and still had a sharp mind, and he would be the one making a copy. But he had 4 older scribes, 2 on each shoulder, overlooking him. And every time he made a little copying mistake, they said, hey, you made a boo-boo there. And so he had to record the mistake in the margin. And the 4 scholars that were overlooking it had to actually initial that they had witnessed this mistake being made. And so it was recorded. So that just gives you kind of the idea, number one, of how the Jews really looked upon their manuscripts. The fact that they invested that kind of effort into making their copies told you how highly they valued these things, and they had to consider them be inspired to go to that care to make copies. But also tells us the degree of accuracy they had in making the copies. And the real evidence for that is when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century. And now they had a 2nd century BC copy of most of the Old Testament. And they compared it with the most ancient manuscripts they had, which was 9th century AD, the Masoretic manuscripts, and they hardly noticed any difference at all between these 2 sets of manuscripts separated by 11 centuries.
Hi, this is Matthew, currently of Santa Ana one more time. I listened to a podcast called Unbelievable ? With Justin Brierley. He's from, I guess, the Premier Christian Radio. Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of debates in that podcast that I listen to. And then they have a debate with somebody, and also Joshua Swamidass. He had a book out called Genealogical Adam and Eve. So this is kind of follow up to his question, but specifically in there he says that DNA is finite. So if we go back enough generations in our ancestry, we would not have a single gene from that, I guess, ancestor. Does that kind of make sense? I was kind of shocked when he said that. He's a biostatistician, and he looked at it, and I was wondering your take on that.
Yeah, he's written a book on this, and we've been engaging Josh for over a decade now, so we're quite familiar with his work. And in his book, he's making the point that you can use population genetics to try to calculate a date back to a single pair, and basically says that you can get a date as recent as 6,000 years ago, or you can get a date that would date earlier than that, which would accommodate our model, or a date that even goes back 1 million years, which would accommodate the model that's being promoted by Bill Craig. So you can get a variety of dates. In our critique, though, we point out that yes, with the population approach that Josh Swamidass is using, you can get a date back to Adam and Eve that spans quite a broad range, but it will not be the same Adam and Eve. You get a different lineage. So it's not like you get a single lineage that's consistent with the different dates. That's not the case. You wind up with a very different lineage. But yeah, it can go that way. But we've also making a point that genetics is a really complex science that's loaded with a lot of systematics, and some systematics, I would argue, haven't even been established yet. And so I've been writing articles making a point that there's a big difference between establishing the systematics and measuring the systematic errors in astronomy and physics than there is in anthropology and genetics. And therefore, the dates that we get can be quite broad. Keep in mind, we do not have a good dating tool for anything between 45,000 years ago and 250,000 years ago. Once you get younger than 45,000 years, you can use carbon-14 dating. It's still got systematics in it, but we can identify and measure the systematics. And when you get older than 250,000 years, you can pick up other radiometric tools that likewise have systematics, but the systematics can be determined and measured. In between, we've got dating methods where we can't even measure the systematics that are there, or even identify all the systematics. And you'll find an article on reasons.org. Just put in human dating origins or errors. It'll pop right up, where I basically go through the different dating tools we have, the genetic tools, as well as things like uranium, thorium, precipitation dating, or thermoluminescence or optical luminescence, and document how the systematic errors can be as large as plus or minus 2,000%. So whenever you see a date between, say, 45,000 years ago and 250,000 years ago, they'll often quote only the random errors or the measuring errors, and they will not tell you what the systematics are, often because they can't even identify them. But they typically overwhelm the measuring or the random errors that are there.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Trish Patino, and I am not a scientist, but I'm a devourer of scientific information. And I was just texting with Josh Swamida, and he said, ask Dr. Grant about me and my book. And I think you just addressed all of that. But anyway, if there are any more observations that you can make on that comparison and contrast, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I have not read his book. I've talked enough with Fuzz and interacted. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about Swaminas's work is it goes back to this discussion of populations and how big things are, because there's kind of a dominant narrative out there that the human population could never have been below 10,000 or 2,000, something that's very much larger than two people. And what, if I understand what Swaminas's work shows, is that it does show that having a population of two is within the realm. I mean, it validates some of the things that RTB has said, even though that's not the popular or the consensus view. It says, yeah, this is actually a reasonable way of looking at things. And so, Swamidas and Reasons to Believe disagree on a number of things, but I think it's been fascinating over the last 4, 5, 6 years to see the things we've been able to talk about. And I think he's someone who has a great deal of intelligence, very passionate about studying things, and really does want to see the church figure out how to interact with the scientific community in a way that advances the kingdom of God and doesn't just degenerate into bickering and arguing and driving division unnecessarily. So he can be a difficult person to interact with, but I really do think he's done some good things. So.
Yeah, and over the past 10 years, we've come closer together on the scientific issues. We're still fairly far apart on how we understand different biblical texts. And I've noticed that too in our engagement with biologos. Our theological differences are greater than our scientific differences.
Here's another question. If we are the only civilization in the universe, why do you think God created such a huge universe for just the people of Earth?
That's a great question. And it takes the universe to be precisely the mass that it is and the size that it is to get one planet. Now, I think God could have done it with a much smaller universe, but it would have required different laws of physics. And what I find interesting is how well designed gravity and thermodynamics and electromagnetism are to be tools in God's hands to relatively quickly and efficiently eradicate all evil and suffering. And I think that's a significant biblical point. You see in different biblical texts, Old and New Testament, that God begins his works of redemption before he creates anything at all, which at least suggests that God's creation, everything in God's creation, is with the intent of making possible the redemption of billions of human beings from their sin and evil. And therefore, interpreting creation from a redemptive perspective, I think, is actually a predictive tool to help us make scientific advance.
So I would, agree, and then also maybe put a different perspective on it. Is that the notion of size and efficiency is a great engineering question, and I agree that God is a phenomenal engineer, but he's not just an engineer. He's also an artist, and he's a poet, and he's, God is more than just an engineer. And so I can't tell you how many things I've built where it's like, okay, I've got it done, but it's like, now what else can I do with it? And so the idea that there's this huge universe, in fact, we may be part of a multiverse, that to me just highlights that God is so much bigger, so much more powerful, so much more creative, so much more thoughtful, so much more knowing than we are, that we're never going to get tired of exploring his creation. And so the implication behind the question is that it seems inefficient, or it seems like a poor engineer or a waste of space, if you will. I think that puts God in too small of a box to look at it that way. So as much as it may be engineered well, I think there's a bigger picture to it as well.
Thank you both so much. We appreciate everything that you helped us with and told us about there. Thank you. We do have one final question, Hugh. How can people get more involved with Reasons to Believe?
Hey, thank you for that question. How can we get more involved in Reasons to Believe? And, the last several months, in spite of this pandemic, things have been exploding at Reasons to Believe. We actually have a Reasons to Believe Canada. We just launched a Reasons to Believe Asia Pacific. We see the potential for launching a Reasons to Believe Africa, a Reasons to Believe Latin America. But these are organizations that are going to need support and help from us here at Reasons to Believe. So we got a campaign this month to raise an additional 100 monthly partners. And these are people that commit to make a financial gift to Reasons to Believe on a once-a-month basis, although I'm a monthly partner and I do it annually because I can give a little more if I do it annually rather than giving monthly. But however you want to do it, that's fine. But we would really be blessed if some of you would consider becoming a monthly partner and enabling us to expand our outreach of providing Reasons to Believe to a world that's searching for these reasons. Thank you. And you can find out about it at the table there.
Thank you both so much. So we had more questions, but we never have enough time to get to all of them. I want to remind you that we meet every other month, the Orange County chapter does, and our next event is Saturday, November 13th. And what we're going to be doing is continuing to explore themes of challenges that have been coming lately to the Bible. And you may have heard this, and you may not, but you will. A lot of people say, well, don't worry about conflicts between science and the Bible. There's not any science in the Bible. And so the question we're going to be addressing next time is there science in the Bible? And the person who's going to do that is Dr. John Bloom, and you've got a handout on your seat or near you that has this information. He has a PhD in physics from Cornell and a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies. So he's got both areas, the science and the theology. He's also started the Master of Arts in Science and Religion program at Biola's Talbot School of Theology. So I look forward to hearing him, and I hope you'll be here and join us. This is the first time that we've ever had both Zoom and in person going on. We hope to try this again. So we'll see. You'll get the information, and if you're not on our mailing list, there's something in your seat there that has the information. Just email us at orangecountyrtb@gmail.com. This goes for people who are online too. If you're not if you didn't get a notification by email about this event, then you're not on the mailing list. But if you'd like to be, just let us know. Thank you for coming.